So this slide just explains what qualifying consent is with regard to DNA analysis under the Act. The Human Tissue Authority Codes of Practice on Consent state that if consent has been obtained for an activity which is a scheduled purpose, it's not normally necessary to take consent again for DNA analysis in the course of carrying out this activity, for example research, but it's best practice to make clear to the donor when consenting them that their material may be used for DNA analysis if this is the case. The consent does not have to be in the writing for the purposes of DNA analysis, but if it was taken verbally, then this should be documented for evidence. In cases where an adult dies, a person such as a relative or friend who was close to them at the point of death may give consent for a DNA test. In much of the Act, this operates on a hierarchical basis, but in the case of relating to DNA analysis, this ranking does not apply. The person giving consent should be encouraged to discuss the decision with other family members, and at the time of discussing consent, it should be raised within the family whether they wish to know of any results that may have potential significance to the family, such as a genetic condition. So this slide covers who can give qualifying consent for DNA analysis with regard to a living person. For living adults with the capacity to consent, consent should be obtained from that individual. For living adults that don't have the capacity to consent, consent should be obtained according to local legislation, such as the Mental Capacity Act in England, Wales, and the Adults with Incapacity for Scotland. There's also guidance on considerations of competencies which is available from the Department of Health. For living children, if no decision to consent or not to consent is in place, or the child is not competent or willing to make a decision, qualifying consent for DNA analysis may be given by a person with parental responsibility, or in Scotland, a person with parental responsibilities in relation to the child. So this slide then covers qualifying consent for DNA analysis from a deceased person. For deceased adults after death, qualifying consent for DNA analysis may be given by anyone who stood in a qualifying relationship with the deceased adult immediately prior to their death. The ranking method specified by the HTA for other purposes, as I mentioned before, does not apply for DNA analysis. So any person in a qualifying relationship listed on this slide can give consent, including the spouse or partner, parent or child, brother, sister, grandparent, grandchild, niece, nephew, stepfather, stepmother, half-brother, half-sister, or friend of long standing. With regard to deceased children, qualifying consent for DNA analysis may be given by a person with parental responsibility as before. If none, a person in a qualifying relationship with a deceased child immediately before their death, as above, can also give consent. This slide shows the flowchart, the HTA flowcharts for DNA consent. So it just takes you through the information on the previous slides in a useful flowchart situation, which you can go through and answer the questions to determine whether or not consent is required and whose consent is required. Regarding mental capacity and DNA analysis, regulations state that the following are accepted purposes for which research involving DNA analysis from adults without the capacity to consent can be undertaken without the qualifying consent. In England, Wales and Northern Ireland, if it's for purposes of a clinical trial authorised and carried out in accordance with the MHRA regulations, purposes of research in connection with disorders or functioning of the human body which has been ethically approved by an NHS Research Ethics Committee and cannot be reasonably be anonymised or carried out on persons without the capacity to consent. For England and Wales only, for purposes of intrusive research under the Mental Capacity Act, and for Scotland, again purposes of clinical trials, and also for purposes of surgical, medical, nursing, dental or psychological research permitted under 51 of the Adults with Incapacity Act, Scotland. In exceptional circumstances, DNA analysis may be used for obtaining scientific or medical information about the person whose body manufactured the DNA, even if their consent has not been obtained. The Human Tissue Authority has established a process to permit the analysis of DNA without consent, provided that it is satisfied that certain conditions have been met. The processes that the HTA have established I will describe in more detail at the end of this presentation. To summarise, regarding consent for DNA analysis, qualifying consent is legally required for research if the tissue is from a living person and the samples are identifiable, from a living person and the samples are anonymised, but NHS rec approval has not been obtained or is not pending, from a deceased person and the samples were collected after the 1st of September 2006. This is true for both anonymous and anonymised. To summarise, regarding consent for DNA analysis, qualifying consent is legally required for research if the tissue is from a living person and the samples are identifiable, from a living person and the samples are anonymised, but NHS rec approval has not been obtained or is not pending, from a deceased person and the samples were collected after the 1st of September 2006. This is true for both anonymised and identifiable samples. For existing holdings from the living or dead stored before the 1st of September 2006, consent is not required. For deceased holdings since the 1st of September 2006, consent is required, and this can be anyone in a qualifying relationship. For the living after 1st of September 2006, consent is required, and it can be generic and enduring. That is true unless the project has been ethically approved and the person carrying out the analysis is not in and not likely to come in possession of identifying information. Then consent is not required. But it's good practice to obtain consent where possible.